Um, Great. So thanks so much, Max. And I just to get the conversation going quickly, I thought that it would be great to have the panelists introduce themselves first, and then I'll introduce myself after that and give a bit of framing for the conversation. Um, but yeah, let's jump right in. Hinako, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm Hinako Sugiyama, a lawyer qualified in Japan and the United States, working at the International Justice Clinic at the UC Irvine Law School. And with the students, aka future lawyers, I'm practicing law, especially international human rights law, to support activists, journalists, human rights defenders, and their defenders around the world. And happy to answer any of the questions that I can answer, and excited to learn from other panels and also the audience. Thank you very much.
Raya, would you like to go?
Yeah, my name is Raya Sharbain from Palestine, living in Jordan. Currently an educations coordinator with the Tor Project and a research fellow with the Citizen Lab. I've worked closely with people who've been impacted by Pegasus, spyware, and others, and work closely with journalists and activists on training them how to protect themselves against state-sponsored surveillance, specifically. And very excited to be here with you and learn from everyone. Thank you.
Great. And how about Jonathan next?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Rugman. I'm joining you from London. I have been a journalist for more than 30 years, a foreign correspondent most of that time for the UK's Channel 4 television, The Guardian and The Observer newspapers before that. And in 2019, I published a book, which is right here, called The Killing in the Consulate, which is the story of Jamal Khashoggi. And to that extent, I obviously looked into the use of surveillance on the mobile phones of Jamal's immediate entourage.
Prashant, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I'm Prashant Anantharaman. I got my PhD from Dartmouth in 2022, and I was mostly focused on understanding how file formats and network protocol messages are parsed and analyzed. And more recently, I've been looking at how you can break web servers and the hospital health software. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about the technical aspects of Pegasus and answer any questions that you guys may have, and of course, learning from all of you and the other panelists. Yeah.
Great. And Max, do you know if Elina has joined yet?
I don't see her, so I think it'll probably be a couple more minutes before she joins, but I may interrupt when she does to say that Elina's got on.
Cool, please do. So I'll jump into introducing myself just a little bit and expressing why I'm so excited for this panel and that we brought it together. So I have been extremely excited about the prospect of this talk for about a year now. I'm one of the co-founders of Fight for the Future, which is a US-based activism organization that works on tech policy issues, among other things, online privacy. And now I'm working on a secure alternative to Slack called Quiet. And anyway, as part of that work, I attended a conference last year of human rights defenders and technologists, where the prevailing topic of conversation at the conference was Pegasus. And it was funny because a few months before that, Jacob, one of our guests here and one of our hosts too, as an organizer of Boston Computation Club, had pointed me to a talk by Prashant's advisor, I believe, Sergey Bratus, about a blind spot that the software industry as a whole has around managing the complexity of parsers that they believe is making the world structurally vulnerable to attacks like Pegasus and making it almost impossible to fight attacks like Pegasus. So at that conference I was at, Raya was also at the conference, and we were in a small group conversation about how civil society could respond and fight back against the threat of Pegasus. And I was trying to represent this perspective from this academic frontier that Prashant and others are at. And I did a very inadequate job of doing so. So I was really excited at coming out of that to try to bring these worlds together. the world of human rights defenders impacted by Pegasus, advocates pushing for the civil society and international response against tools like Pegasus, and researchers at this frontier of academic computer science that seems to have something very fundamental to say about how we might defend ourselves against Pegasus and how activists and advocates might advance technological shifts that could put us in a better position against tools like Pegasus. So, so yeah, I mean, with that, I think we can jump right into our first questions. And to give a bit of sense of the structure or the ideal, this will be fluid, and audience members should raise a hand and feel free to jump in with questions. And we have a lot of time, which is good for a conversation like this. But to give a sense of what the structure of the panel will be, as I see it, or the ideal structure, first we'll talk about the impact of tools like Pegasus. Then we'll talk about what's being done to fight back and push back against that and defend ourselves against tools like Pegasus. And then finally, we'll get into this question of what areas of frontier technological or frontier scientific research in computer science can have something to say about how we might defend ourselves better at Pegasus. And then finally, we'll try to synthesize all of that. So that's a pretty ambitious goal, but I think we can get there. And I just noticed that Elina has joined as well. Yeah. Elina, we just did a round of introductions, and I was just kind of wrapping that up and moving us into the questions. But so this would be a great time for you to introduce yourself.
Awesome, thank you very much, and apologies for being a few minutes late, but hi everyone, my name is Elina Castillo Jimenéz. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm a researcher and advisor at the Security Lab at Amnesty Tech. It's great to be with you.
Okay, thank you. And so yeah, we'll start by looking at the impact that Pegasus is currently having. And this part of the conversation might be bleak, is very bleak. But my hope is that things will get that we'll start to find. We'll hear more about the response to it, and that will be more encouraging. So to start, my first question is for Raya. Can you give us all a sense of what being targeted by Pegasus means for human rights defenders now, and what the overall impact is of tools like Pegasus?
Yeah, of course. So first, when people started hearing about Pegasus, it might have been during the Pegasus Project's big release, the project by Forbidden Stories and colleagues. It was scary then. I think a lot of people didn't know what this was and how what it meant if it was on your phone. There was lots of questions, more questions than there were answers. And as time evolved, more people got used to it. So I live in Jordan, which is a country which has many and maybe one of the largest numbers discovered of Pegasus victims. And so it's become almost a thing that a lot of people within civil society, human rights defenders, lawyers, human rights lawyers, activists, and beyond are used to. It's now part of the vocabulary to know that there's something out there called Pegasus and you might be impacted by it. Generally, how it's impacting people, one of the things we notice very quickly is there is a sense of fear that immediately comes with the news that you've been targeted by Pegasus. And there becomes a hyper-awareness of surveillance that I think is normal to Jordan if you've ever been to Jordan. But then to learn that there's this capability to do more targeted surveillance and what that means and what it means for Pegasus to be able to listen to your mic, to open your camera and so on, how that changes your behavior. I've seen people change their behaviors around their phones. I've seen them now, for example, enter meetings and exiting their phones and not having them around them at all times, not saying things over the phone and preferring face-to-face meetings. Unfortunately, we've seen that people have also retreated from civic and political life as a result, but it's not a broad case. I guess this would warrants a larger study to understand that effect on civil society. But I think what it has achieved, unfortunately, like I do see these tools as a tool of control. And we've seen that the more the use of it has increased in Jordan, the more targets we found. So we know that there are cases of Pegasus, for example, in Jordan since the ones documented are from 2019 up until 2023. We still haven't found anything in 2024. But you can see the reports, you can see more and more reports from human rights organizations saying that the status of Jordan's freedoms have largely decreased to a country that has become almost not free. It's a very repressive state, and I see that play in tandem with the tools that the state has to use and squash civil society.
So in my next question, I'd like to get at what's special and new about Pegasus. I think this question maybe is best put to Elina. So Pegasus is offering this ability to do zero-click attacks against phone numbers via these ubiquitous applications like WhatsApp and iMessage. What makes this so powerful and dangerous? And is this just the same threat as traditional wiretapping, or is this enabling a new kind of oppression and creating new kinds of fears?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think before trying to give an answer to that, of course, this is framed from my background and perspective as a human rights lawyer, and also seeing how these tech tools can be used to cause human rights violations, right? Particularly, as Raya was saying, against journalists and human rights defenders. So I think the particularity of the zero-click attacks, on the one hand, is that it's pretty hard, as many of you here today can imagine and know from the technical perspective, to protect yourself from those attacks, and to even know when the attack is taking place, when the infection is taking place, or even if what level of access to your data the user of Pegasus has had once it managed to infect your devices and getting into it. I think also from a legal perspective, it's pretty tricky to be able to document it. And I think this is where the value of forensic analysis comes into play. Both, many human rights organizations globally have been developing protocols to be able to document the use of Pegasus against human rights defenders, journalists, and members of civil society. But at the same time, the secrecy around the surveillance industry, it make this to be a constant iteration between, we found a way to document it, and this can be used as evidence, for example, to bring forward cases. There's always that gap between the moment where the attack happens and linking it back to who may be behind it. So I think that that's the fear, and it's not necessarily the way that I typically talk about it with human rights defenders when we are able to conduct forensic analysis on their devices, and what we identify that definitely they were targeted with Pegasus, is that, of course, it's scary. That's the reality of it. It's typically, the first reaction is typically, I'm scared of what they might have found. But more often than not, there's an element of being concerned for others, of course, because this has a chilling effect on people. The idea is not to instill that necessarily, but of course there is a difference between a zero-click based tool and traditional wiretyping. Now, I would say, based on our research, I'm not necessarily a fan of the idea of ranking, and I know that wasn't necessarily the intention of the question, but just wanted to clarify it, right? I'm not necessarily pro ranking which one is worse than the other. I think all of these tools that facilitate surveillance over people that challenge the status quo and are trying to exercise rights are just different manifestations of how power tries to sustain itself, especially in contexts where speaking out against it is seen as a threat. So that's how I would characterize it.
Yeah, and it's interesting how my impression is that previous to this, you might get an email with an attachment that was malicious, or you might get an email with a phishing attempt, but you could forward that email, and that was an artifact that would sort of prove an attempt to infect you. You might even perceive that it was happening and not open the attachment. But with zero-click attacks, there's this element where they can get in, potentially erase all evidence of being on your phone, or most evidence of being on your phone, and get out with your data. And it's the forensic piece becomes very difficult. And so let's see. So my next question, I guess, would be for Jonathan. So you covered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi for The Guardian and wrote a book on the topic, as you mentioned. So do we know yet whether or not Saudi Arabia used Pegasus on against Jamal or his wife?
We know that Jamal's wife, Hanan Alatta's phone was compromised by Pegasus, but it probably was not installed by the Saudis. It was probably installed by the Emiratis. Jamal's private life was very complicated. So he, in the last year of his life, in June 2018, he married an Egyptian air stewardess in Alexandria, Virginia. And while they had been getting closer, she, and one of the reasons I think that he married her was that she had been arrested in the Emirates where she lived, and her phone had been taken away from her. And when it was later analyzed by, I think it was the Citizen Lab, if not by Amnesty Security, they found the Pegasus software. The other main point of contact for Jamal was a Canadian Saudi dissident called Omar Abdulaziz, who was a good friend of Jamal's. And it was Abdulaziz was the kind of canary in the coal mine, because he, in 2018, discovered from the Citizen Lab that Pegasus had been installed on his phone. And the point of all this is that Jamal had sent Omar Abdulaziz more than 400 WhatsApp messages, many of them critical of the Saudi Crown Prince. And Omar in Canada is naturally, understandably, feels, I think, a guilt that perhaps those communications that he'd had with Jamal were intercepted, and that had given cause for the Saudi government to act in the way that it did by killing Jamal in October 2018, an act which the Saudi government doesn't deny. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that a Saudi hit squad killed him. The other element that gets into all this, which is the hacking of Jeff Bezos's phone, and whether an act of revenge was carried out by the Saudi government after Jamal's death, because of course Bezos owns the Washington Post. The Washington Post was Jamal's employer. The Washington Post naturally investigates Jamal's murder, and within a few months of that investigation starting, revelations about Jeff Bezos having an affair are published by an American tabloid publication, and Bezos orders an investigation, wonders whether his phone has been hacked, and reaches the conclusion, having employed FTI Consulting to look into his mobile phone, that the hack came via a WhatsApp message that he had opened from the Saudi Crown Prince himself. So you can see the tentacles of this thing spread far and wide. And it's surely no coincidence that one of the text messages that Omar Abdulaziz received in Canada, which came dressed as a message from DHL saying that you have a package waiting for you, the same day, a Saudi dissident in London got the same message, a guy who had nothing to do with Jamal Khashoggi. So, it's both the circle of Jamal Khashoggi, it's Jamal Khashoggi's employer, it's people who've got nothing to do with Jamal Khashoggi. As for Khashoggi himself, well, his phones are still in the custody of the Turkish government, who haven't handed them back either to his wife or his fiancée, the woman who was waiting for him outside the consulate in Istanbul on the day he died. So, we may never know whether Jamal's phones were compromised or not. Seems highly likely to me, but we just don't know.
So we could go now in the direction of thinking about the state of play. I'm interested, but maybe perhaps it might be best to talk about the proliferation of these tools. Right now, it seems so. Pegasus is the leading product, and NSO Group is, the leading vendor. But of course, spyware weapons have proliferated to some degree. Would anyone like to respond to that question of what are we seeing in terms of proliferation or maybe even democratization of hacking tools as outside of the case of NSO Group and Pegasus? Like, do we think, what in one aspect of that question is, do we think if civil society is able to do something about NSO Group and Pegasus, if that will be the end of the story, or do we expect this problem to kind of metastasize in some way globally? Hinako, do you have a take on this, or are you following? Do you have any sense of the spread of these tools?
Sure, of course. So your question is about the proliferation of spyware outside of Pegasus, and also possible civil society's countermeasure to it. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, NSO Group Pegasus is one of the most, sort of like prominent products, but keep new products that keep coming up, one in Greece or one in Singapore, so everywhere. I mean, in a sense that, Pegasus absorbs all the like bad reputations, but like as a behind the scene, hidden scene, while Pegasus is so like prominent, and then more other spyware vendors are of course selling that product without under no regulation, and then so that's the status quo, and then so for the like countermeasures, I think so we can talk about like political action as well as like legal action to be filed by victims, and yeah, and then for the political action, I think the sanction is a big part of it. For example, in response to the like civil society's advocacy, the U.S. government is now trying to use every possible mechanisms out there to restrain like spyware industry. For example, using the so-called like entity listing, like which means U.S. companies cannot do any transaction without the prior license with the NSO Group, or entry ban imposed to the U.S. Entry ban on the foreign individuals in the industry. So that's great. And then, but at the same time, one thing to note is because NSO Group is, and also other spyware companies are mostly like private companies, they're not, publicly traded. So it means that we don't really have access to their financials. So we cannot really see this like US action to which extent, which is like effective for them to let them bankrupt, right? And so like a global concerted effort is very much needed in this area. And also, as Elina says, so from legal perspective, so in addition to the political action, the legal action filed by the victims, that are really, really important to set the standard, as well as empowering the victims, human rights defenders, to restore their autonomy, restore their control from the government. And then so NSO Group's business is technically they are violating the law, existing law. Let's say many of you are familiar with this law about Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or more like brick and mortar law, let's say trespass to chattels or like that. But what I would like to emphasize is that although NSO Group or other companies are violating the law, there are a lot of multi-layered challenges for victims actually fighting the litigation and winning the case. There are a lot of like legal hurdles. I don't want to like dig deeper into like legal jargons, but there are like foreign sovereign immunity doctrine, which will be applicable to spyware vendors because they are selling the products to foreign sovereign, and also other doctrines are like forum non-convenience. But anyway, so. And also evidential hurdles, definitely, Elina kindly mentioned, but a lot of that spyware has the function to cleanse or clean up their evidence of hacking. So basically for victims, it's kind of really hard to, just know the fact that their devices are infected. And also, even if the evidence is secured, but oftentimes the attribution to a specific perpetrator, that is also quite difficult. And also there are also practical hurdles. Let's say victims must firstly check their phones, but I'm involved in like sub-Saharan Africa related spyware cases, but activists there are kind of like really pessimistic, like nothing to hide, because activists are born to be like surveilled. So we don't really have nothing to do for this situation. So then that really like dissuaded them to just like check their phones. So that's something we really have to, address first. And also, of course, like hiring a lawyer is expensive. Finding pro bono lawyers is not easy. And also, court system, what we imagine about the United States or Japan is different from like a global majority or global South countries, because courts are often like tainted by the like political power. So anyway, so to make legal action also possible, many things have to be done. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to that as an activist here in the US working on privacy issues. It was extremely difficult to hold the executive branch in the US accountable to the values of the country or the law of the land when it came to surveillance. And it's a really hard fight. I'm interested in, well, one follow-up question on that might be, what about the Apple and Meta lawsuits currently against NSO Group? How did those fit in? So just for background, Apple and Meta are currently suing NSO Group and successfully moving that through the courts and getting through disclosure, getting information about NSO Group's targets, I believe, or some of their exploits. But how does that fit into the overall push? Are you optimistic about that, or would you say that's a small part of the overall non-proliferation push?
Yeah, definitely that was a big step. So as a background for the WhatsApp case, that was filed in 2019, and then the NSO Group defended themselves that we are protected under the sovereign immunity doctrine, and then that went to the Supreme Court, but Supreme Court dismissed the writ for certiorari, and then the case went back to the district court, and then recently the district court ordered the NSO Group to disclose the codes which are used for the the relevant target. So then, but still, not the details of the disclosure order is not really out there. I mean, which as a lawyer, we really have to see what that disclosure bring to bring the more transparency in that industry. And also, one of the sad thing was, of course, WhatsApp was requesting the disclosure of their clients, but the court order didn't include that part. So yeah, definitely that's a great step, but and also but at the same time it really takes time. So it's big progress, but still a lot to go.
Yeah, Elina, I see you had your hand up. Was that to follow on this question?
Yeah, if I may, if it's possible.
Please.
From your perspective.
Please,
Yeah, I definitely agree with Hinako on some of the points that she's raised. I think another case that is often and not often on the radars of people that's also linked to this is that of the NSO Group. So there's a group of journalists, very brave journalists from El Salvador, that were targeted with Pegasus. We're talking about, if I recall correctly, the numbers, at least 14, like an entire newsroom definitely was targeted from this newspaper that in El Salvador is seen as an independent news outlet. Colleagues at the Knight Institute were the representatives of their case, and the case was dismissed. So even though it was very, very connected and linked in a way, although obviously it was being evaluated and ruled and treated separately from the Apple and Meta versus NSO Group cases, it was interesting to see how in a case where we have actual victims and individuals that with evidence are, trying to demonstrate we were targeted with this software that definitely threatened our human rights, and definitely that information was somehow habilitated by using service in the US or communicating through that, and it was dismissed. So I think that going back to the original question that you posed, Holmes, like, well, all these political developments globally and going after companies, is it is it a solution? I mean, it's great to see some positive steps, as the US said, as Hinako mentioned, and Europe has been a little bit more silent, unfortunately, but at the member state level, there has been some developments. The way of going against companies in a way is also trying to tackle actual products like Pegasus, like Predator. But the reality of this, at least from our perspective of Amnesty, is that the industry itself, it's a problem, and this type of highly invasive spyware should not exist, point blank period. Because there's no way that from the design of it, you can guarantee that the use of that tool will not violate human rights. So we call for a ban of those sorts of spywares. We just don't want to see them. That's just to put it in very, blunt terms. We think that there's no way that anyone can guarantee that they won't violate human rights. And when you say it from the perspective of due diligence or the perspective of a company guaranteeing that their products are not going to cause harm, there's no way that you can guarantee it. Other forms of spyware that maybe have other guardrails that from level 0 of design, you can guarantee some level of restrictions. Perhaps we can have a conversation about adequate regulation on their use, but Pegasus and the likes, they should just not exist.
So Prashant, please jump in.
I have a follow-up question for Hinako, actually. So what really is the consequence? What consequences would the NSO group face, for example, if they were not to comply with that court order? Specifically with respect to WhatsApp and Meta. I mean, they are a company that's predominantly not based in the US, right? So are there any legal consequences?
Yeah, so I needed more detailed research on this, to be honest. But I think that if the NSO did not comply with the court order without any valid reason, I think it constructs liability either on civil or criminal. So in the end of the day, the court can't really force, right, to disclose the information. But so at the end of the day, at the minimum, the NSO group got to be liable criminally or civilly, civil liability.
Yeah, and this leads into my next question, which is which I think Jonathan and Raya will both be able to speak to, which is the NSO group, and the other operators in this space as well, they have a home jurisdiction, and so NSO groups is Israel. There are similar companies operating out of other countries. Now, the home jurisdiction potentially faces some international pressure, right? Some international non-proliferation pressure for hosting these companies. However, they also have some advantages to hosting these companies, some incentives too. And I'm really curious in your perspective of how that plays out for NSO Group, what the downsides are for Israel in hosting NSO Group as it comes under more and more international pressure, but also what the upsides are for Israel hosting NSO Group and providing this technology to other countries.
I can certainly talk about the upside, if you like.
Yes, please.
I mean, Israel has a very free press, and the Israeli press revealed that Saudi Arabia had paid the NSO Group $55 million for Pegasus in 2017, which is when the pressure on Jamal Khashoggi was building. It was the last 12 months of his life. Not long, a few years after that, Prime Minister Netanyahu met the Saudi Crown Prince in secret in the desert. And the Saudis have never admitted this, but Netanyahu leaked it because it was in his political favor to be showing the Israeli public that he was building a relationship with Saudi Arabia, a country which has still not officially recognized Israel's right to exist. So there is a geopolitical background to this, which is that Israel, through its military technology, spin-offs from the military industrial complex, if you like, is producing products which the Arab world wants. And Saudi Arabia is a clear example of that, as is the United Arab Emirates, which I referred to earlier. And one of the, I mean, we just saw Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, meeting the Saudi Crown Prince this last week. And one of the things that the Saudis want from any potential recognition of Israel is the continued flow of technology. And so it isn't just about peace for the Palestinians. In fact, prior to October the 7th, Palestinians were not the top issue for Saudi Arabia. The top issue was technology transfer, and my enemy's enemy is my friend. In other words, a close relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia would further isolate Iran. And that was... So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, there are definite benefits from the Israelis being able to sell their neighbors technology which they could not otherwise have, and technology which they are very free to use in autocracies which, you know, don't correspond to the rule of law as you and I might understand it.
I'll respond to that and first say that this is a technology that not just the Arabs want, but the Israeli occupation wants first and foremost. And it's been documented that, so when we talk about surveillance, we have to talk about who builds it and why they build it, and who are they interested to survey. And you've mentioned the military industrial complex, and I think the Israeli occupation built from the ground up as a settler colonial entity is very much interested and invested in surveying the population it controls, which are the Palestinians. And Hamle, which is a digital rights organization in Palestine, in 2019 uncovered in a report that the highest number of surveillance companies per capita was within the Israeli occupation. I will disagree with you that this Israeli occupation has free press, because I do not believe there is free press within a settler colonial state. But they very much benefit from hosting all of these companies. A lot of the people that go ahead and establish the NSO group, Quadrim, Kandiru, and even the company and the group Intellexa, which is hosted in Cyprus but ended up producing Predator, it was actually founded by Tal Dillian, who's an ex-Israeli intelligence officer. So all of these people tend to graduate from the same place, from the Israeli intelligence services, from specific units where their sole purpose and goal was to develop and deploy cyber mercenary arms and deploy them and use them as a testing ground on Palestinians first, and then export these tools of control and surveillance to other people around the world. And so you can almost map that with every deal that happens between, be it the NSO group and another country or whomever, it follows. So I'm talking about normalization deals. So if Netanyahu goes to Mexico and does a normalization deal with Mexico, then comes the use of Pegasus in Mexico. Same thing happened to India. Same thing happened across the Arab world. This is why you see it used within countries where the countries that have formed some form of normalization deal with the Israeli occupation. So that includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, with the so-called Abraham Accords. Jordan signed in 1994, so it was no surprise that, well, we don't have proof that Jordan uses it, but it was no surprise that it's in use in Jordan. Egypt uses it, Sudan, and has a normalization deal with the occupation, Morocco, but you don't see it used, for example, in Tunisia or Algeria, who completely do not recognize this occupation. So it's almost in tandem, and this is not a sheer coincidence. And I think for me, it's almost, if we want to talk about spyware today, we need to talk about the Israeli occupation. That is a must. And we need to talk about why it is that a lot of it is coming from that specific entity and how it's being deployed. And how it's being used as a diplomatic tool and to further autocracies and repress rights around the world, and not just on Palestinians. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, I think that...
use this. I wanted to answer someone on the chat, but maybe I'll let you go home. Sorry.
Please, yeah, there are some questions in the chat about shareholder liabilities for NSO Group. If anyone would like to jump in and answer those, please do. Was that the question?
There's the very, very first one about Bezos not being able to protect himself from Pegasus. I'm not sure if there'll be an opportunity later on to talk about this, but I'll highlight this, is that one of the things that Apple has done, and this is not to congratulate Apple, and I'm not sponsoring Apple here, but Apple in late October, I believe, 2022, pushed a feature on their phones called the lockdown mode. And up until today, there is no discovery of a successful compromise on phones that have had lockdown mode on. This is to say that with technical tools and features within operating systems, there might be ways we could protect people against very sophisticated cyber attacks, such as zero-click exploits from spyware. So I wanted to highlight that because it's not a lost cause in that sense.
Yeah, and that's very much my interest in having this conversation today. And Prashant is sort of an expert in the theoretical framework for stuff like lockdown mode, I believe, and so I think we could jump right into that. I do want to. So first of all, Raya, I mean, you're the one I think who introduced me to this idea of spyware as a tool for diplomacy. You know, in the quid pro quo of normalization and malware weapons exchange, and that, just to make things a little bleaker, that seems like a very serious problem, because it aligns the incentives of the home state with the spyware, with the malware weapon industry, and it could be that, you know, and that those are incentives that could end up becoming operative in other contexts too. If even if we're successful against NSO Group and Pegasus in Israel and they get booted, which seems so far from likely at this point, the incentives would be the same somewhere else. And it seems very difficult to, in that context, to rely purely on pressure, because of course the pressure goes both ways. The more other states want these tools, the more incentives a home jurisdiction will have to protect their domestic spyware industry. So yeah, we have this question about shareholder liability. Okay, so Hinako responded in the chat. Do we want to, Hinako, would you like to build on that response, or is the response in the chat pretty much what you would say?
Yeah, pretty much that's it.
Okay, great. So let's.
Oh, sorry. I raised my hand. My apologies. Yeah, I could just put it in the chat. I have another take for the.
No, please jump in.
Oh, well, just try to be briefly. I wanted to also hear what Prashant has to say, and thank you, Holmes, for moderating this conversation as well. I think on the shareholders' point of view, from our perspective, something that we have tried to build, and we did release a report a couple of years ago, I want to say maybe 2 years ago, it's kind of trying to also follow the money a little bit in the case of NSO Group. Technically, shareholders have a duty to make sure that wherever they invest, and this is derived from international human rights law, wherever they invest and facilitate businesses, that doesn't cause harm in the human rights lingo. And I believe it was last year in January, I gave testimony to the Oregon State Congress, because through the US legislation, there's this element of ESG investment policies that at the state level, people can inquire about and request information on. In our research, we found that one of the investors on NSO Group, which is, you know, funds within funds, that's typically how it works. One of these funds was actually gathering resources from the Oregon pension funds and being invested in companies like NSO Group. So we did raise this information to the state level, and some members of Congress opened up a commission to kind of look into this within the framework of like this ESG policy. So I think that there are mechanisms by which you can, as an individual, without necessarily having to have all this technical expertise even, raise these concerns and make sure to also follow the money and kind of close that you know, river a little bit. So yeah,
and to round this up, I think it is a good time, and Raya, thank you for the segue to talking about sort of technical countermeasures and things like lockdown mode. I think it is a good time to shift into that. But before we do, just to establish, you know, I think we spent some time talking about the impact of Pegasus. We've now spent some time talking about civil society responses in international law, in the courts, and you know, the geopolitical incentives that surround states that oppose or that harbor these companies like NSO. But are there any other avenues of activism or advocacy outside the technological realm that we'd like to talk about before getting into the technical countermeasures? Are there any other glimmers of good news or of hope, or avenues that seem fruitful?
Well, I think the Apple and the WhatsApp legal cases are absolutely key. We saw President Biden about a year ago issue a decree banning US government agencies from using spyware, which could be buying spyware, which could be used against human rights defenders, which is not to say that the US government doesn't want to develop its own technology, and I'm sure probably has. So I think there are positives out there. I feel especially sad for the Arab world, I think, more than anywhere else, which is not to say, as has already been mentioned, it's been used in Mexico, it's been used in India. But I think it's the sort of icing on the cake for the failure of the Arab Spring of 2011, that governments that have bounced back even more oppressively than they were before, and this is particularly true of Egypt, which is the biggest country in the Arab world, are using this spyware as a new means of stamping out dissent and exercising control. And that is the degree of that. I think the degree of the loss of personal freedom is unprecedented, which is quite a thing to say.
So let's, yeah, and I think there's something where, well, let's jump into the technical discussion of countermeasures. So this is going to look like me asking Prashant a bunch of questions, and then anyone else who wants to jumping in. I've let one of our panelists lie silent for some time now, but I'm really interested in, because Prashant's not just a technical, someone who understands the tech. Several people on the panel understand the tech, but Prashant is in a very narrow and specific and not so well known area of work within technology that might have something to contribute here. And so that's part of the exchange I'm trying to get to kind of flourish here. And so yeah, I've got some questions for you, Prashant. So what I'm going to start with, maybe my most fun question, which is sort of like a question about how Pegasus works, but a more exotic version. So how would you say, well, okay, so the question is, how has NSO been able to find exploits so reliably? Like, they're not just finding a 0-day once in a while, they're building a product out of it. They're building a software as a service style product out of it. So they have customers, those customers want uptime, they want the tool to keep working no matter what. And they're going against some of the biggest companies in the world, companies like Apple, that have very good security teams, or the have industry standard, top of the line security teams, a lot of resources. So how are they able to deliver exploits so reliably, and what would you say? And this is the kind of fun part of the question. What's the connection between Noam Chomsky's work in linguistics, a Boston person, Noam Chomsky's work in linguistics back in the 70s, and the recent Pegasus iMessage exploits? And could you kind of walk us through that?
Sure. I'll tackle the first part of the question first, I guess. Historically, most of these attacks, like the $1 million dissident attack, where you send a link manually, and things that were prior to that were all based on the fact that you, as a user, have to click on something. And we call that social engineering, where you have to trick someone into clicking something. And a lot of the spear phishing and phishing attempts, those kind of attacks fall under that category. But then, as you've all talked about it, this zero click was kind of a revolution. It like sparked a huge debate and it scared everyone. And the way that the WhatsApp calling attack worked in 2019, where you send a sequence of RTCP packets, which is a protocol that's used in voice and video calling. So in that particular, what you do is you craft a series of them that are malformed based on the specification of what the protocol is. And then that kind of triggers a bunch of vulnerabilities in WhatsApp's own implementation of the protocol. And then Kismet and Forced Entry and LastPass, they all build on this core concept of having malformed data in some way. So then when you build a software, you always expect to receive like either valid data, or you have to actually validate it in the first place, right? Like, so you need to have some code in your software that's going to validate it and make sure that it's well formed and it's going to run correctly. And only if I validate this is the rest of the code going to work correctly. But then what we have seen is that this particular piece of code, which is called a parser that's meant to validate code, is quite often the place where you find the most vulnerabilities. Like, for example, in the last year, we were looking at web applications, like just websites. And we only focused on this particular really narrow aspect of your code, which is the parser. And we found over 100 of them, 100 of such vulnerabilities that you also see exploited in the case of Pegasus, for example. So as a security researcher or reverse engineer, this is the piece of code that you always focus on, which is the parser. And when you try to reverse engineer what's in the parser, and when you try to dig deeper into what's going on and how things are implemented there, you will often find tons of these vulnerabilities that you can then try to chain and exploit. And how this ties into Noah Chomsky's model is that what Noah Chomsky actually described was a hierarchy of languages that can be used to describe, like it's used in linguistics, but then in computer science specifically, it's also used to describe how complex a particular input language is, for example. And the way that you actually figure that out is by having a hierarchy of like regular expressions, followed by context-free languages, context-sensitive languages, and Turing-complete languages. And of all the attacks that we've seen in the Pegasus landscape, forced entry was possibly the most interesting one. And that was because they used a bunch of really neat tricks, like starting with the fact that you send a PDF file that actually has a GIF extension, for example. So you look at it and you're like, oh, that's a GIF. I can like render that in your iMessage app, right? But then when you actually look at the actual file format inside, it was a PDF. And then when you actually try to figure out, okay, now I know it's a PDF, how am I going to actually analyze the file and render it? Then you figure out that, wait, there is this particular library that I have to invoke, which is called XPDF. And then that has an implementation of another library called JBig2, which is a streaming protocol. And then what you figure out is that you can use chunks of these JBig2 messages to craft what is essentially an entire computer. Like, so basically you can have like individual logic gates. If you're familiar with how logic gates work, you can have AND or NAND kind of gates. And then you can construct miniature versions of them and try to chain those. And then essentially what you have is an equivalent of any programming language at that point. So it was really neat because they were able to construct such a miniaturized architecture within their exploit chain. So then the PDF file itself had these chunks in like unbounded memory, which is like outside the bounds of what you actually allocate. And they were able to use these to actually escape the sandbox. And sandboxing is another mechanism that's very commonly used. And another interesting thing over here is that the whole forced entry way of exploiting, it even bypassed the blast door, which was like a sandboxing framework that iOS had implemented as a response to Kismet and all the WhatsApp calling and kind of those kind of attacks. So as a response to those, they actually built a whole sandboxing infrastructure. But then NSO came up with this really incredible attack where they were able to bypass even that.
Yeah, and so there's one thing I want to put a highlight on, which is really interesting to me, and this was in the talk. Sergey Bratus is your advisor. Is that the correct relationship label? Okay, cool. So,
yeah.
So, in the talk that I saw that your advisor gave, the point made was that when you parse data from someone, you're giving them your computation. You're giving them a computer. when you parse data from somebody you don't trust, you're giving someone you don't trust your computer. And when you parse in this Chomsky hierarchy of languages, when you parse recursively enumerable data from someone you don't trust, you are almost definitely giving them a general purpose computer that they can do whatever they want with. It's just on them to figure out how to make it work. Is that a fair summary of both what you were saying and the kind of state of things here?
Yes, and I think there is a point to be made here, which is, can you actually very reliably verify if an input is valid or not? And where in the hierarchy can you actually do that? So when it's a regular language, that problem is known to be decidable, and you can very accurately estimate whether this input is valid or not. But when you start going into even context-free languages, there is that problem hasn't been solved yet from a computational point of view and a mathematical point of view, and then it gets more and more complicated as you move on to other languages in the hierarchy.
Got it. And so we have the situation where if we were, if the way WhatsApp worked or the way iMessages worked was that we were sending data to each other that could be validated with a regular expression. If you're familiar with like regular expressions in computer science, or that is very limited in the amount of complexity that it has, then we know at least mathematically we would be able to build software potentially that was not vulnerable to attacks like the one that Pegasus is using. There might be side channel attacks, there might be other things going on, but we'd be in a very good place. But that as soon as we increase the complexity just a little bit, not even maxing it out, as soon as we go to the next level, we don't really know. And that's still an unsolved problem. And
so one counterexample to that is that it's very hard to stay in the regular expression family. Like, for example, if you just add a length field, you're already in the recursively enumerable languages at that point. So context sensitivity is where you end up if you just end up adding a simple length field. So you can make that argument that you should stay under regular languages, but it's practically close to impossible.
Also, sorry, I missed the term you're using or the word you're using. If you just add a what in that sentence?
A length field.
Okay, got it.
So basically,
this is a message of length. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, like you have in a very like let's just talk about a JPEG image, right? Then you have chunks inside a JPEG image, and then you say you have a magic value, and then you say how long this particular chunk is, and then you have those many bytes there. So even in a language where it's as simple as that, where you just have chunks following one another, but you have a length field there, you're already in a very complex state when it comes to the formal language that you're in at that point.
Got it. All right. So now let's hit it from the other side. And I sort of framed this by saying we would jump into giving Prashant a bunch of time. And now I want to kind of pull back from that a bit and think about, okay, Raya made the point that we have Apple's lockdown mode feature, and that empirically, it seems that it is helpful, that we have not yet had a case, an established case of Pegasus malware successfully used against someone who had lockdown mode enabled. Let's talk about lockdown mode. So I definitely want to, at some point, turn this to Raya to talk more about lockdown mode. Hinako or Elina or Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to jump in with and talk about regarding lockdown mode? Have you used it? Are you advising people to use it? Is it part of your organization's security posture? Is it something you think of as hopeful? Are you, what do you think of as the state of play there? These are my questions, just generally about lockdown mode. We'll approach this from the other side of, okay, Apple's trying to do something, and then we'll get back to the theory of it.
Prashant, do you want to go first? Do I go? I want to. Yeah.
You should go first, Elina.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think lockdown mode is it's a resource, just as, for example, having like helplines from civil society to be able to conduct forensic analysis and elevating the knowledge amongst human rights defenders of how these tools can work and how you can be targeted and why. And like, I think it's part of wider, perhaps, ecosystem. In there, I will also add the notifications, of course, that Apple, more recently also Meta have been conducting, of letting individuals know you have been an object of a state-sponsored attack or a government-sponsored attack. So that's how I will frame it. I mean, I definitely use it, and I know that activists do use it, but it's in the grand scheme of things, and it's not trying maybe to reduce merit to it, but it's also like that using those tools has to go along with continuing the work of like tackling these tools and hopefully not have them exist ever again, so that we can all be safe and exercise our rights as we should.
Yeah. Yeah, this is it's very similar to the position I feel like we were in after Snowden with encryption, where the movement was horrified at the degree to which the US had been violating the privacy of everyone around the world and people in the US. And we wanted to hold them morally accountable for that, and we wanted to change that and stop them. But we also wanted to, at the same time, see if there was a way we could protect ourselves in case we were not able to do that. And so there's sort of these multiple tracks of there's a battle here and a battle here and a battle here, all kind of happening at the same time, and we have to almost, yeah. So anyway, this is really interesting to me. I think, Raya, do you have any perspective? Would you like to continue on, in your perspective on lockdown mode?
Yeah, I've personally in every training, it's something that is advised to enable at all times, actually, for most people who we know are within target groups of state-sponsored surveillance and spyware. I know that, for example, Apple is very open to receiving feedback on lockdown mode and how they could improve it too, because it does limit some features on the phone. And so it's been interesting to just get people to use it every day and seeing how it's just been annoying to them and how this can be improved further on. I subscribe to the school of thought that says, let's just improve things technically. The legal stuff will take forever. It will never get there. And it's probably best if we get all the technical protections we can get, which worked post-Snowden because end-to-end encryption and HTTPS and all of that became the norm now. And so I'm all for improving and putting all the money on or not all the money, but putting most of the money on the technical protections that one can get. So unfortunately, this is only available on Apple products now, and basically iOS, macOS, and iPadOS. But I'm hoping that this kind of feature of trying to see what a lockdown similar feature can be available across other OSs. So if Google deploys something similar for Android, that would be good. Because in most places where you find something like spyware, you'll find more Androids than iPhones. And we cannot continue to convince people to buy an Apple product in order to deploy a lockdown mode on it. And yeah. So I don't know if people know so lockdown mode, I think, is one of I would have chosen another name because people tend to think it's used in other operating systems to mean something else. But on Apple, it's basically if you turn it on from your settings, it's going to limit some features like on your phone, on iMessage, you cannot open PDFs normally or images. You're not going to be able to receive FaceTime calls from people not within your contacts and that have not contacted you previously. And links on iMessage are not clickable, so you'd have to copy and paste it on the browser. So that's to avoid one-click attacks. And there are other things like that. If you open a website, I feel sorry for all the people who took a lot of time to design nice websites with a lot of JavaScript, because with lockdown mode, it just limits a lot of it. You see very little icons. And so, yeah, you just get used to the phone. It's almost runs okay on the phone. Your phone runs almost normally, sorry, but you will notice some things that might bother you. For parents, for example, we got one parent to tell us that they couldn't use parental controls while lockdown mode was on. So that actually limited them from using lockdown mode, just from the sole fact that they couldn't use parental controls. So yeah, it's something we do advise, although despite all of this, to use on a daily basis, like keep it on.
Yeah. And what's interesting about lockdown mode is it lines up with what Prashant was saying about parsing, right? It's that functionality reduction, what you're seeing there is the limitation of how much parsing you're giving, especially to someone you don't know, to a call from someone who's not in your contacts, to a message you're receiving in iMessages. So yeah, I'm interested. I mean, this is also, I said at the beginning, other folks could come in, jump in with questions. We have some questions in the chat. There's some questions about some conversation about memory safety. There are, I think there are probably technical best practices and countermeasures or industry norms that, if shifted, would put people in a better position against malware outside of this reduction in parser complexity and things like lockdown mode. I'm interested if anyone would like to jump in with a question or something to contribute to the conversation. That would be really cool. Also happy to keep going. If any of the other, yeah, Max, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, we've been having this chat in the chat, and maybe we can move it to the conversation. Some of us, you've got a bunch of computer scientists in the audience, so I apologize for the overly technical question, but we're curious about analogous technical question for like Spectre and similar attacks. Are there efforts to make it so that there's like, in essence, morally a lockdown mode for chips where you can say, boy, I'm okay with having a much, much, much slower piece of hardware if it's more secure, and I can make it be in that mode for some period of time while I do my sensitive stuff. Maybe I go back to fast mode when I want to play a video game or whatever. What does the threat landscape look like with respect to kind of the LangSec perspective on hardware at the moment?
Yeah, so I think one way that I like to think of it is that we need defense in depth, which is like you can't just say that you improve your parser and that's a silver bullet, right? You can obviously have very well-formed, valid packets or inputs that is still going to compromise your system in some way or get it to crash. So you do need to have multiple levels of depth when it comes to security here. So one initiative that I really like, and I think it is kind of synonymous to what you call lockdown mode for parsing bugs, would be the Cherry project, which is like a whole new architecture of how you would build a computer, but keeping in mind memory safety primarily. And as we talked about the zero-click bugs, a lot of them do rely on memory corruption issues like buffer overflows. And the whole Cherry project is primarily based around how you can improve memory safety while keeping performance pretty much intact, because once you start doing things in hardware, it's like you do get a lot of these performance additions. Yeah, that's how I would answer that.
Are there any follow-ups to that from anyone in the audience as part of that conversation?
Hi. So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a question. So in general, is it undecidable to make sure that some application is memory safe? Like, can't we just simply make sure like it doesn't read outside of the memory that it's allowed to read? Like, how hard is that? Is it like impossible?
Yeah, I think it is possible. But at that point, you have something like an interposer that's going to intercept every memory operation, and you're trying to do validation based on that. And you can even think of it as imposing a compartmentalization of your program, where you're trying to say that when you're in a certain compartment, you're not allowed to access this and this memory, right? And you can kind of do those as well if you start intercepting memory operations. And there have been several initiatives to do this. Some in hardware using tricks like memory protection keys, for example. It's called MPKs. It's an Intel extension. There are similar ARM extensions as well. I think the ARM extension is called memory domains. And so yeah, there have been several attempts at intercepting these memory operations and trying to make sure that they are valid. And even like only saying that you can access only these sets of memory. When you're in this portion of code, you can only access this memory, for example.
So what is the major hardship of integrating this kind of project into like everyday people's life?
Speed. You do lose a lot of performance when you start doing these things. And as I was telling Max as well, when we tried some spectrum mitigations a few years ago, like one of the biggest issues was you do get a pretty huge hit when it comes to performance. And a lot of people are not okay with that. And when it comes to trusted applications, I think now there is a more recent push to start incorporating things like Cherry in those models. And the other thing over there is that like speculative execution is a relatively recent concept. So you could use chips that don't really have those features, and you would get things that are much slower, but you could.
This reminds me, this reminds me of the situation we were in the mid-2000s, where even something like SSL was considered impractical because of performance problems, and so the effort by organizations like EFF and others to push forward SSL, like ubiquitous SSL, like SSL not just when you're entering your password or entering your credit card, but SSL across the whole site. That just ran up against complaints including from engineers saying this isn't practical. We won't be able to make this work. This will be too slow. So when I hear that there's a framework for thinking about security that we can apply here, and the reason that we aren't doing it is because it's so slow, it rhymes with that. And I wonder if there's a path to mainstreaming these technologies where we increase the learning rate around them to reduce some of the bottlenecks, or find middle ground where you get some sweet spot of performance and protection that comes with mainstreaming this tech. And and on top of that, I'm wondering if civil society, including folks here, can be part of advocating for the necessity of taking those steps, right? The same way civil society is advocating for ubiquitous SSL back in the day. So I see a hand up from an audience member who's also my advisor, Guillaume Marceau. Guillaume, would you like to jump in with your question? Guillaume, you're muted.
Thank you. So my question is, I'm going to ask from the perspective of programming language research, because that's the research I used to participate in. I used to follow the academic research on automated debugging, where the research question we're pursuing, we're kind of come up with maybe a search algorithm inspired method or an AI inspired method to inspect automatically a program and find bugs, and automatically generate test cases to speed up the tedious work of debugging a program as we're developing it. And it occurs to me to ask whether there's a corresponding thread in the research for automatically discovering vulnerability in code, and whether that's becoming more severe. Going back to the question you were asking earlier, Holmes, how does NSO keeps finding vulnerabilities so quickly? Is this process of discovering vulnerabilities being made easier through automated vulnerability discovering? And is that becoming more severe with the recent breakthrough in AI?
Yeah, I think this is something that we can only speculate about, because we don't really know what NSO's methodology to finding these bugs is, right? But then there has been significant improvements when it comes to fuzzing, which is the approach to finding bugs automatically by there are various ways that it works, but then the most traditional way would be to pick an input and try mutating it, and try to use that to trickle down in your code path and find bugs that way. And certainly the most sophisticated tools used in fuzzing, one of them is AFL++, and the other one would be libfuzzer, and they have improved a lot. And so much so that they've also been modularized in such a way that you can plug and play various components. And yeah, I think recently Max has been trying out a tool to do some of this like automated test case generation to find bugs as well. Yeah.
We have a question
Max,
about Pegasus. Oh, sorry. I was also going to note that we have a question from Maciej about Pegasus and forensics that might be good for Elina, since your organization is involved in some of these forensic operations.
Yes.
Do you see the question in the chat? So the question, I'll just read it out here for anyone who's watching the video. Can Pegasus be detected by looking at a phone's logs? For example, the frequency of acquiring GPS logs, battery usage, changes in network traffic, etc.
That is, I gotta be transparent. That's not a question for me though, because I'm not one of
Okay.
our technologists, but I can bring it to my colleagues and confirm to you on that. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, my sense of it is there's a bit of a chicken and egg question where once Pegasus is successful, all bets are off and they can go at whatever infrastructure you have for logging. And do we have any other hands up? Raya.
I can attempt to answer that. Often spyware leaves no traces. And I think this is why it's costly as well, is because it works really well to leave zero trace on the phone. But usually, yeah, for depending on the OS, you pick out certain logs from that phone. And so Amnesty will have its own way of looking at these logs and detecting, depending on certain indicators of compromise that they collect. And some are made public, and you can find, for example, via the Amnesty's mobile verification toolkit. So some of these indicators of compromise. So basically telling you how they detect Pegasus on phone and other sort of malware. You can find them there, they're public, but other times they're kept private for valid reasons, because it is also a cat and mouse game, predator and prey. So you don't want to let people know how you're detecting it, so you can keep detecting it and they don't change their ways. Sometimes it leaves certain traces. Sometimes they really try to stay as untraceable as possible. It can be a certain, let's say, a process on the phone that has different name than regular processes on certain OSs. But yeah, and oftentimes if it's just a one-click attack, it can be that someone received a message on WhatsApp or SMS, which are easy to pick out from backups usually. So you can find them because it's an odd link. If it's a short link, usually they usually raise red flags. Another way of also looking, network traffic is good. If you have a targeted person, it's not a bad idea to set them up on a private VPN and just keep monitoring that network traffic. Because obviously if spyware is on the phone, it means there's some sort of download, but also a lot of upload of data that's happening and going towards other places. And so that would be good to detect. I'm just giving very generic answers, but I'll leave it with one more is one way also to see if there is any network injection attacks happening via HTTP sites that you're visiting. That could happen. That has happened recently, and it was detected with the phone of Ahmed Tantawi, who's used to be the front runner against the Sisi in Egypt before he was not able to run against the Sisi. The Citizen Lab detected Predator on his phone and multiple attempts to target his phone via zero-click, one-click, and also network injection. And so the network injection, they found that there was a middle box within Vodafone Egypt that mapped to a Sandvine middle box that was constantly attempting, while he was connected to mobile data, to inject the malware to Ahmed's phone by waiting for him to visit an insecure website, basically, until they could hold on to that traffic and then inject that spyware. I hope that makes sense, but this is one trace that you can find if you see someone visiting an insecure website, you can ask yourself, why are they suddenly visiting an HTTP and not HTTPS site?
That is an extremely comprehensive answer. Thank you. And yeah, and it also reminds us of the case of the Russian security team that was hacked by somebody, probably NSA. They found it by seeing something suspicious in their workplace's network logs. So that's that's a, yeah. So let's see, Max.
Yeah, I've got a question for, I think, Hinako, but honestly, there's so much expertise here that if any of the rest of you want to jump in, feel free to, which is, are cyber weapons regulated the same way that like a missile is regulated or an AK-47? Like, how does that differ? And also, like, could we live in an alternate universe where where Pegasus was made in a Five Eyes country like New Zealand and still got sold to places like Egypt and Mexico and whatnot, or would it have not been able to be sold to all these countries had it been within that Five Eyes network?
Thank you so much. So basically, it's so surprising, but no regulation really installed there. Who can make spyware or which functions? Because let's say a lot of spyware has a function to cleanse or clean up their, evidence. That is per se violating international human rights law or constitutional law, but there is no specific regulation. That's the reason why, spyware industry, private companies can manufacture it without no restraint to any countries. So what is really needed is to put like private industry under super, 100% like complete control, which function, they should have, and also which government they can sell. But currently at this moment, no regulation out there. But one thing I can point out is export control. I don't know whether you guys know about like Wassenaar arrangement. So in Wassenaar, I believe that was 2015. So they created one item under control, which is called intrusion spyware. And then, so that is like, that not legally binding, agreement, but in response to that, the members of the Wassenaar arrangement should implement, the Wassenaar arrangement. So now the United States or Japan or other countries, just member states, and unfortunately, Israel is not a member of Wassenaar arrangement. So they, heightened the export control. But the membership of Wassenaar arrangement is limited. And also, it's just export control, right? It doesn't regulate anything about one country's domestic use of spyware. So yeah, so that is like short answer. Not really super comprehensive, but.
Yeah, I would like to add, also based on one of the comments that I'm seeing in the chat about, I think it's from Mashek, I hope I pronounced it correctly. As Hinako was saying, the short answer is no, there's no regulation. There has been attempts from different spaces of like trying to include spyware in treaties that are currently being negotiated, like the UN Cybersecurity Treaty that's happening as we speak. There has been also attempts at the EU level to include it in acts that have been debated in the European Parliament. The European Parliament last year had a commission of inquiry called the PEGA Committee to try and sort of mobilize some of the information about how Pegasus works into codified law, but that unfortunately was not successful. I think that there is a difference from I would say international human rights law on, and it was probably sort of like a joke, but it's like when we talk about spyware, we're referring mainly, and I know that maybe at the technical level we can have conversations to distill it, but we're basically talking about tools that allow for surveillance of individuals in a way that's either targeted or massively made. In this case, with Pegasus, Predator, and the like, is targeted surveillance, and that leads to other forms of human rights violations, right? So, we can talk about like consented sort of like sharing of information or anything like that, or those of us that use like health devices that track your heart rate, etc. Like those obviously can be tools that can be weaponized in a way, but that's, I think, a separate conversation. I know you all know this, but I think it's just important to make the difference because the requirements for what is needed to comply with from the developer and company's perspective can be a little different from under international human rights law. I think when it comes to spyware, what we have seen, and obviously, again, this can be debated in the technological, the technical aspects of it, but the approach that we have taken, as I was mentioning earlier, is either it's highly invasive or non-highly invasive, but still problematic. And I think that for those sort of bigger buckets, we can have further conversations about how to combine national level initiatives with international level initiatives to regulate those.
Cool. Thanks for these. I mean, this is, I just want to encourage, people in the audience who have questions like these to keep asking them. I mean, this is a great opportunity. I think one of the questions I have for Prashant and Max, and potentially others here from the academic computer science research community, is just having heard everything you've heard today about the impact of weapons like Pegasus and the intense difficulty of addressing the problem through traditional policy work, like all of the hurdles that we face. Do you feel that research into these areas, these frontiers of computer science where potentially solutions lie, do you feel that research is being adequately prioritized and researched within the broader research community? Or do you, because if not, there could be an opportunity there, right? So I'm curious what you think about that.
I think it's a complex answer because it is being explored quite widely. It is there are commonly government-funded programs as well that explore these problems. And we do see things that are coming out, but I think the rate of adoption and productionalization, if that's a word, is a little slow. And to actually get incorporated into the larger companies is a little slow. One shout out I'd give is to Microsoft Research, who did build like a formally verified parser tool called LowParse that is being it has been actively deployed for the network protocol analysis. And yeah, just like that, if a lot of these other companies also start adopting such formal analysis tools, that would be great.
Any other insights on that from Max or from the audience? Do folks agree with that assessment that it's about the academia to industry pipeline in this area being slow?
I would definitely agree with what Prashant said. I study formal methods. I'm a formal verification PhD student. And my feeling is that there's not enough grant funding for things like the intersection between HCI and FM, or work that's about usability. And every few years, we get a report from NSF or DoD that's saying, boy, there's all these really amazing mathematical techniques that nobody uses because they're incredibly difficult to use and you need a PhD to do anything with them. And I'd like to see more grants being awarded for projects that take academic work and just make it highly ergonomic and usable for normal people.
Got it. So when you say normal people, you mean normal developers and normal users and typical internet users at the same time?
Yeah, all of the above, right? There's like the performance aspect at the chip level that Prashant was talking about previously, and there's everything in between. Like in the chat, we have Chang talking. So okay, Chang just finished their PhD in programming languages, and Chang was just talking in the chat about using a secure version of malloc, which means that the memory allocation is more secure on their computer. But there are a lot of these individual technologies that can be deployed in a way that's easy to install, easy to set up, and potentially fast enough that you're okay with it. But I don't think you necessarily get a POPL or CAV publication by making like secure malloc marginally faster so that more people will use it. You get that publication by coming up with a better version of secure malloc from a theoretical perspective. And so I would like to see more incentive for like this kind of usability work, both for developers and for just people like Raya who need a secure phone, right?
Got it. And this is the kind of thing we see in that in some areas of industry, for example, AI/ML right now, the pipeline between the academic frontier and industry adoption is very, very like high bandwidth and high velocity, right? People are ripping papers off the shelf and implementing them right away. And it's because there's a bubble, there's a huge industry there, there's a huge amount of economic value that they're trying to unleash. And so Yeah. So what are things we can do to change the calculus or change the environment as activists and advocates? What are things we can do maybe to change the overall environment such that companies are pulling this research right off, hot off the presses into their organizations, into their practices, into their products, and users are actually benefiting from them in a time scale that's not like 2 or 3 decades or something like that. That's more like 5 years. Um, and I mean, if we are there, and this is actually a point of where I'm ignorant. What are the most, who has been the loudest so far in terms of um, issuing either demands or praise to companies for either what they haven't done or what they have done to protect human rights defenders from tools like Pegasus? What's the state of play in terms of pressure on companies to do this better? Since that seems like that's one part of the force that would kind of pull these things out of academia into industry and into users' hands. Have there been any campaigns, kind of any shaming campaigns that are memorable in this space about any of the big techs when it comes to like, I mean, I remember I was horrified that at a time when activists were being targeted by Pegasus, there was not even a way on an iPhone to disable iMessage. Like it was just installed by default and you couldn't even turn it off, even though it was obviously extremely vulnerable because anyone in the world could send you very complex data, just knowing your phone number. But are there any notable accountability campaigns that groups have mounted to get corporate behavior to change? Not the spyware companies, but the companies whose products we use.
Elina, if you are more knowledgeable about this, but in spyware domain, I think the advocacy against Francisco Partners, which is like San Francisco-based venture capital, I believe like civil society pressure materially forced them to sort of divest their shares in NSO Group. So that is one precedent, and also a lot of advocacy against Berkeley Research Center, which has the authority to manage the fund. But I think it's already like the shares of NSO Group was taken over by somebody else in Israel. So there are a couple of precedents, and also so do you know the technology which is called like UFED, which is provided by the Israeli company called Celebrite, so which is a not remote hacking tool, but it's physically like connected to the phone, and basically the functionality is just the same as spyware, which can like extract all the information, whether encrypted or not. So then that company, so it used to be a private company, but their owners decided to bring it to like publicly traded on NASDAQ in New York. And then so at the time, so I was at Access Now, and then I started to feel like this should be stopped. Before addressing the human rights risks, because there are a bunch of like reports that the technology is used in Botswana, Indonesia to pressure like LGBTQ activists or human rights defenders. So then, so we implemented the advocacy effort, exposing that, human rights violations, and they stopped, approving that, public listing of that company. So then at the time, the company value, shareholders' value, got really like plummeted. It dropped very like severely. So, but in the end of the day, the IPO got like went successful. So anyway, in the end of the day, it's just a soft law, naming and shaming. It's not like legally really like tangible. So there's a limitation, but a couple of success stories as well. So I don't really want to like lose the hope. Yeah, I started to feel like I'm so like pessimistic listening to all others, like discussions about how we can else do. But anyway, so.
Yeah, so there's successful naming and shaming campaigns against investors in malware weapons and in companies building malware weapons that are active in US or European markets, perhaps. Probably there's less, and I remember after Snowden, there were naming and shaming campaigns aimed at US companies for not providing encryption. So Yahoo for a while was the last, they were the last to start encrypting server-to-server email. and there was a campaign to try to get them to change. There were a few of those, but I wonder if there could be an opportunity now for campaigning to try to change company behavior. And we have hands up from Raya and Elina. Company behavior on in terms of like Apple, Google, Meta. Cool. How about Raya first, and then Elina?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that within civil society groups and organizations fighting against things like spyware, you tend to have those like Amnesty that call for a moratorium, like a global ban. And then you have the voices that says, okay, it's already there, we just need to regulate it. I'm for the camp that says global ban. And I think we just, I guess I'm not answering your question directly, but I do kind of wish that there was a more unified voice against a global ban and then a campaign towards that, because then you get into this very murky place of how do we even regulate such a powerful tool, an invasive tool. And then I think last year at some point the UK Parliament was going to pass, or there was a discussion, and someone who lives in the UK can please fix me, or correct me, sorry. But they were talking about possibly allowing certain vulnerabilities within operating systems to stay, and pushing certain companies and operating system developers to let these vulnerabilities stay so they could keep exploiting them. But this didn't pass, and I remember seeing some noise online around it, but I can't remember how this suggested bill did not pass at the end. But yeah, it seems to be a lot of scattered voices, not a unified voice, but I do wish it was more like a louder and unified one.
I think the debate in the UK, certainly led by the British spy agencies, is about regulating AI, and AI being perceived as a threat to democracy as a whole, whereas phone hacking being perceived as a threat to individuals. And it seems to me that the debate over the future of AI and ChatGPT has displaced any debate about spyware. And even though the circumstantial evidence around the murder of a journalist is incredibly strong, and perhaps the worst example that we have, and as somebody said on the chat, if Jeff Bezos, the world's richest man, I mean, it's less, isn't it amazing that he was hacked? It's even more amazing than that isn't it amazing that he's done nothing about it? I mean, if you look at how quiet he's gone, and if you balance his business interests, on the one hand, he's got the Washington Post, which is a trophy product, lovely thing to have, great newspaper. And on the other hand, he's got Amazon's interests in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And I suppose it was a missed opportunity, as I see it, that a figure like that should decide to go very quiet indeed. So a year after Khashoggi's murder, he attended a memorial service in Istanbul, just outside the Saudi consulate. And neither he nor his security advisor have said anything about the case since.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we have two hands up. I'll send it to Elina, then perhaps Maciek, then we'll return to Hinako. We have a question from Alicia in the chat. Cool. Lots of voices coming in. This is good. Elina, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to be brief. I think the first thing I would like to say about your question, Holmes, is at least in the human rights field, the road towards ensuring accountability and protection for all of us is typically filled with like small wins and then bigger wins, and it's a long-term project. When we were a part of the Pegasus project, we were the tech partner for that project. We definitely have seen a change in the way that conversation around spyware is happening. It's not to say that it has been solved clearly, otherwise none of us will be here. But it's definitely taken a little bit of a turn in certain spaces and circles. And I think that probably, if I had to guess, and this is pure speculation, not necessarily focused on actual hard evidence, but I think the combination of actual evidence on how many people around the world have been targeted with this, combined with the demonstrated limitations that we in civil society have to go around and document even more cases, show that there's a real concern about this. And then, of course, you do have to ask yourself the question, like, when certain countries like the US and some in Europe have, taken an approach to this in a way that seems to be, some people might say, more aggressive towards that, you do gotta wonder, well, is it the fact that maybe some of your members of government have been targeted, that has mobilized this? Like, what has changed? Because the information from civil society has been consistent throughout in ways of, like, these are tools that are being used beyond what governments have been saying, which is the typical national security efforts. It's not necessarily that, it's beyond this, and it's typically not happening in a vacuum. I do want to challenge the idea that only quote unquote bad governments have used this against human rights defenders. I mean, we have cases in Europe, we have cases in the global north, we have cases in the global south. The key thing here, if we wanted to make a trend, is that as long as you're an individual that is seen as a target to the, threatening the status quo, then you're gonna be a target of this. And as long as the government can get their hands into this, then you're gonna be a target. I mean, I'm gonna bring the example of the Dominican Republic, which is one of the countries where we have found cases in the Americas. It's a small country in comparison to others, and yet we have found cases of Pegasus in it. So it's not a question of democratic or non-democratic, it's rather a question of how far is power willing to go to sustain itself. Now, on the question of campaigns, I do want to believe that the fact that we have an entity list and the fact that we have an OFAC list and a visa travel ban from the US perspective, it's a way of, like, trying to see, okay, there's some momentum in there. We can have questions about, is this going to lead to something long-term, or what are the intentions behind it? But the reality is that these are tools that, and I'm going to say with a full mouth here, this is because of civil society work. This is because many of us around the world working together, even though perhaps there's not a united voice, as Raya was saying, but elevating this information and saying this is an issue and states need to take action on it. So naming and shaming combined with action is what I think that is gonna be helpful. So yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Hinako.
Thank you. Very quickly, and a little overlap with what Elina said, but in order to bolster more like naming and shaming campaign, because basically compared to the private companies, like government has more stringent disclosure requirement. So one of the things we can do is, because in the spyware domain, we see really like lack of transparency, lack of information disclosed, documentation on the victim's side, as well as government's use, purchase of spyware. So one thing we could potentially leverage more is freedom of information request to the government. So then, and then revealing what sort of like spyware companies governments are using, and then bolstering the campaign against companies as well. So yeah, one potential suggestion is FOIA request.
And Cheng, you had your hand up, and also Alicia, if you wanted to jump in with your question from the chat after Cheng, that would be cool. But otherwise, I could also echo it. Cheng, please.
Hi, thank you. So I was trying to add something to your previous question, which is about, have there been any pressure on companies to secure their product, right? So I have I think many of us here have seen so many, well, not so many, like at least couple mails from your mailbox saying that our information has been leaked, and there's a class action lawsuit which give us like $2, right? So it's very baffling to me, like why these kind of, like, this is not like a single target. This is like very large scale information leak, causes like minimal damage to the company. And so I was wondering, what are the legal, what are the legal and sociological cause of like this kind of very minimal damage? Like, why can't we enforce like a more secure system on these kind of companies?
Yeah, and there's sort of two sides to that too, where there's the breaches that affect many, many people at once, and then there's the vulnerabilities that affect very few people, but affect a very few people very intensely when they're used to target them by tools like Pegasus and by governments. Would anyone like to speak to that? I mean, I have some thoughts I could share, but I mean, what's so hard? What is so hard about you know, why can't people sue Apple when their phone is hacked because of an iMessage vulnerability? Why can't people sue Meta when it comes in through WhatsApp? Why isn't there more liability for large-scale data breaches that affect people by, spilling out their passwords everywhere, and then someone can use those passwords on other websites if they've made the mistake of using the same password twice? Yeah, what's the state of that? I mean, maybe, Hinako, you're coming at this from the law perspective. Do you have any sense of this? It's a bit outside of your realm perhaps, but what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that court's, calculation method of a privacy violation there's a like inherent limitation, because just like privacy violation, that doesn't mean that, tangible damages, right? So that's a sort of like one existing hurdle for the court to find like more damages, effectively incentivize companies to, pay more attention on their like security. But definitely, it's not the end of the story. Of course, we have the political will so that, effectively engaging with the legislatures and then, to change the law to be applied.
Right?
I'm not a legal expert, but I can say for people who have been targeted, one thing they've been the most constant questions we get is they want to raise a case against the state that targeted them. So usually these spywares are sold to states, so it's obviously going to be a state. Which state is you and your best guess? But we can ascribe intention as much as we can to the ones we hate the most. But and that is a losing game, because I can't raise a case against the state if I have no evidence that this is the state that hacked me. And for me to know which state hacked me, I need to reveal a contract. To reveal a contract, I need to talk to NSO. And so I need to first raise a case against NSO, which is what El Faro tried to do. And I was very upset, Elina, when you broke the news that the case was dismissed. The El Faro's case was dismissed in the US, because that would have set a precedent where more groups from different countries could go and raise a case against the NSO. And so the conversation started growing from there. Is like, okay, so if people don't hold a US nationality and weren't on US soil when they were hacked, do they have jurisdiction to raise a case against NSO? Because now you can raise a case against NSO in the US, considering Apple and Meta's cases. What possibilities do you have? And they're very limited for people who are not based in countries. There's no sort of, again, not a legal person, but no sort of universal jurisdiction pathways available for targets as well. So the main case is they don't want to raise a case against Apple. They want to raise a case against the state that hacked them, which seems to be, there are many layers of protection between them and that state.
Elina, and then I have a question for Prashant that I think is a fun question.
Yeah, just briefly, Raya said it exactly right. I think like another example I just can bring is NSO Group has publicly said in statements and everything that they only sell their products to governments, law enforcement agencies, as a way perhaps to, I don't even know what they're trying to do with that, to be honest, to be quite candid here. But it's typically really tricky to be able to get the state to disclose the information, because Hinako was saying, well, let's try to use freedom of information and access requests, which they can work, and it's a way that we, civil society, document, cases, but to a certain extent, because typically this information is protected by national security elements. So it's like the use of this blanket term in a way that is absolutely not consistent with international human rights law and with most domestic legislations, but yet we keep facing these hurdles. So then the question for companies in a way is like, well, if you know that your product is that you develop is going to be used, and it has been used like that, are you just going to continue to be driven by profit and just ignore the harm that is causing? I mean, I think that's the question, really.
Yeah, and well, I actually forgot what I was going to say about that, but I'm really interested in this question of negligence. Like, there's this question where, okay, why aren't companies liable, right? And it is, so as Hinako pointed out, you do have to show harm, but in these cases of people being targeted by Pegasus, we do have harm. And suing NSO Group is difficult because they're wrapped into the geopolitics of their home country, and that home country will protect them. But in the case of Apple or Meta, whose vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities in iMessage were what let NSO do its thing with the forced entry attack that Prashant described. Prashant, is there a way that you could say, could academic experts in the area of LangSec or in the area of memory safety or formal systems make an argument that Apple, by having an SMS app that receives messages from strangers at a phone number and parses PDFs, even parses GIFs that are actually PDFs, that they're being negligent, and that their negligence, that when someone is harmed by an attack, they're harmed partly because of the NSO attack, but also because Apple, a US company with a lot of resources, has done something that experts in the field consider to be negligent. And I wonder if that could be used to build up a case that would create some consequences or liability for Apple and Meta that would not force them, but push them or encourage them to draw from academic expertise and secure their products more effectively.
I think if you start making that argument, you're on a slippery slope at that point, right? Because where do you see people not using different data formats? Like any messaging app, you see that happening. You see it in electronic health records, where you can upload PDFs, you can upload images, you can upload anything for that matter. So you kind of see this everywhere. At that point, like, you'd be suing everyone for negligence, right?
Yeah, so it's a funny thing where it is kind of negligent, but it's also kind of ubiquitous. And so there needs to be, like, where do you start that process of changing norms, which is sort of similar to encryption. It used to be negligent but ubiquitous, that all of your session keys after you logged into a website were shared in the clear, over HTTP, and anyone on your Wi-Fi network would be able to access your Facebook account because Facebook wasn't encrypting session keys. But we were able to change the norms and redefine what counted as diligence or negligence. And but yeah, it's interesting. We're at a point where negligence is so ubiquitous, we're stuck. That's sort of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the primary distinction between the cryptographic case versus the case of memory safety and parser correctness is that in the case of cryptography, the problem was that there were you had to add libraries that would enable you to do this encryption. Whereas in this particular case, you're asking people to rewrite whole chunks of their code in a better way, or to change the architecture of the hardware that they're using. So I think that's where the primary bottleneck comes, where there may be tools and architectures available that you can adopt reasonably quickly to get a bunch of guarantees. But then you're asking these large companies to devote hundreds of engineers for a certain amount of time to rewrite a lot of code. And I think that's one of the biggest issues right now.
We should probably do parting thoughts soon and then wrap up, because we've taken everybody's time for 2 hours, which I really appreciate. So I just want to make sure we're aware of the clock.
The last hour flew by. I did a time check a little while ago, and I was like, oh, wow, we have a lot of time left. To me, this last mini conversation is very interesting, where we've seen that, civil society can be very adept at naming and shaming. The problem is naming and shaming NSO doesn't work, or is limited. But if there's naming and shaming combined with changing the norms about what's considered best practice, as Maciek in the chat put it, what's considered best practice when it comes to securing people's devices. If we could declare a new kind of best practice that was consistent with protecting people against Pegasus, and then achieve a few victories in getting some big players to adopt those best practices, then the wheel starts turning, where you can go to slightly smaller players and say, wow, well, Apple's done it, why haven't you done it yet, Meta? And you can start kind of moving things along. And this is something that civil society is very good at. We're very good at creating conversations about these things and about saying, here's what needs to be done. So those are my final thoughts. Does anyone else have any parting thoughts?
Well, I think I just wanted to say, like, from our perspective, there's the process towards tackling these issues. It's probably interdisciplinary, so there's value, obviously, in having this sort of spaces where different expertises can be combined and just brainstorm a little bit about how we can do without this. So I just wanted to share my appreciation for it and just encourage you all to keep reflecting on this and see how we can put computer science skills and technology skills and lawyers and everybody skills together to just ensure that people don't have to worry about being surveilled every single day of their lives.
Yeah, I have very quickly 2 points. So basically, private companies are so like destined, so designed to maximize shareholders, profits. So first of all, this industry, this spyware domain, private companies, private profits interest should not have been, in. So much work should be done, and as Elina mentioned, interdisciplinary collaboration gotta be one of the keys, definitely. So I really do appreciate this opportunity. And the second point is, so the perspective is from like a global majority or global south. And as I mentioned, sub-Saharan Africa, that is one of the top markets of spyware. There's evidence that the states already purchased and used against people there, but not a single litigation has been filed there. Let's say in Spain, Catalan people targeted, and over 60 litigation has been filed. So active advocacy in Europe or in the United States, but none is happening in Sub-Saharan Africa. So definitely, computer scientists or cybersecurity researchers' expertise in global north should be shared with the global south, and to think about how to cultivate the civil society's reaction there, because the victims are in these countries, not in the United States or not in Europe, but there, more people there, victims are. So yeah.
Jonathan, are you giving your final thoughts? Because you might be muted.
You're quite right. Yes, my
Thanks.
concluding thought is that, I hope this chat has inspired all of us to keep making a noise and to believe that there are some parts of the world which we can't do very much about, but there are parts of the world that we can do something about, and that the business of naming and shaming, has its role. Whether you're a journalist or involved in human rights work more directly, there hasn't. Touch wood, the stories of Pegasus use have declined in various parts of the world because of the attention that is constantly brought to it, including by members of this panel. I think that is an optimistic take. And the thing that's occurred to me while we've all been talking is, nobody knows why Jamal Khashoggi was killed. It may have been because of the columns he wrote in the Washington Post. But the alternative take is that the messages that he was exchanging on WhatsApp with a Canadian dissident were actually about a plan he'd hatched to give Saudi activists foreign SIM cards so that they were less likely to be put under surveillance. So there's a very bitter, cruel irony there that surveillance may have been used against him, which may have exposed his own anti-surveillance work for citizens inside Saudi Arabia, which is something to think about.
Any final thoughts from Raya or Prashant or any other members of the audience?
I guess I'll go quickly. I think one thought I have within civil society spheres is I do wish that we graduate from this privacy framework of how we talk about spyware and talk about it more as surveillance and who does the surveillance, and really trying to draw out all the networks that make the surveillance possible. I also want to challenge the global north, global south dichotomy, because I don't think it's necessarily separate. If we do assume that the states where in the region I'm in the Middle East and North African region, where Pegasus and other spywares are predominantly used, these states, their fundings, for a lot of it, they're funded by the United States and a lot of the European Union. So the government's budgets, maybe for the big majority, comes from that. So if we do assume that they did purchase these spywares, it was purchased using that money. So I guess this kind of breaks that dichotomy by saying that this money is also used to further the control that these states have on their populations in the region. And the third thing I think about is accountability for many people is not just going to court, and especially there's been lots of discussions here about that. So in local courts, there's no belief in the local rule of law for valid reasons. We don't live in a country where there's a clear separation of powers. And seeking justice in other courts where there is a very high consciousness within the people here that these other courts are sometimes the reason we have a lot of troubles in our regions, seems like it causes this dissonance that people don't want. Obviously, it's not going to make things easy. A lot of the times, accountability is not sought in courts and is not wanted to be sought in courts. So I think this is something also to take into consideration. The final thought is a more depressing one, is that I grew up in a place where I was taught surveillance is the Secret Service agent car parked outside your house and looking into who's coming in and out. It's wiretapping, so don't mention a certain state official's name on the phone. And it's very basic and, let's say, palpable and visible. Whereas nowadays with this kind of spyware, it's become this very invisible form of control and surveillance that you don't know you're being surveyed until you test. And oftentimes people notice they're being surveyed not because they test, but because they notice that other parts of their lives are going haywire. So they're suddenly being, in cases of people who have private offices, contracts suddenly get canceled and they don't know why. Things go haywire. They're suddenly banned from traveling. Assets get frozen. They get a court case thrown against them from something unrelated to their activism, to their political activism. So that's often a sign that they are being surveyed, and it's not even that very direct sign of surveillance. It's not a gun to the head. It's very much the effects of surveillance itself. So that's why sometimes someone comes forward to test. So sorry for taking time. So I'll just finish with that by saying, while we can look for forensic evidence a lot of the times it's talking and understanding how surveillance translates on the ground, and especially this kind of surveillance.
Yeah, I think like Raya had mentioned that they've not found any kind of new exploit chains when it comes to Apple's lockdown mode. Like I'd want to think about why those kind of features are not there by default. Like for example, like even in email tracking, one of the most common ways is to embed like a 1 pixel by 1 pixel tiny white image, right? So then why isn't this a lot more ubiquitous, and why isn't this like the default, like privacy by default, to kind of prevent these kind of surveillance operations is one thing that I do wonder about. Like even in WhatsApp, it does allow you, like by default, it allows anyone around the world to call you on it. Shouldn't it be turned off by default? That's one thing I wonder about from time to time. Like they do make you go through a bunch of hoops to turn these features off. And the other things I'll sort of say and conclude is that like in the Linux kernel, there is a new effort to try and use Rust, which is our type-safe, memory-safe language. So that's, if that does happen, there are some skeptics, but if that does happen, I think that'll be a big, like a big step in improving the security posture of the Linux kernel, which is used both in Android as well as in servers and other operating systems. And yeah, the other thing that I'm hoping that it does come forward in the next decade or so is the like we have cryptographic coprocessors. I do believe that for to parse like the really common file formats and network protocols, we don't need coprocessors that can do it like really fast and at line speed as well. And I do think that there are research efforts underway to do that, and we'd probably see that as well in the next decade or so.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the panelists for coming. This was really amazing. It was, difficult to organize. There's so many talented people who agreed to join, but we really appreciate that you took the time, especially 2 full hours to talk to us. And thank you, Holmes, for having the great idea of the event and for moderating it. I'm going to email all the panelists afterward to make sure everybody consents to having the recording put online. And if anybody doesn't, it'll be deleted. And regardless, I just want to say thank you again to everybody for coming. This was really fantastic.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
everyone.
much. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.